In this video, we'll cover some of the actors, tools, and issues in foreign policy. The first thing I like to mention when I talk about foreign policy is the fact that foreign policy is dealing in a context that's quite different than the domestic realm. So in the domestic realm, within the borders of a country, one has a government, and within the context of the government, there are laws that are passed, and there's a clear enforcement authority, and the laws themselves are non-voluntary. In other words, citizens don't individually get to decide whether they're going to be bound by a particular law. It's quite a bit different in the international arena. There isn't a government. There's no government in the international arena in the space between countries. There is just more or less governance, more or less order that's achieved. And there isn't law in the same sense. There is certainly a field of international law, but that international law is referring to treaties and agreements which are, for the most part, self-enforcing or mutually enforcing. In other words, the parties to the agreement find ways to try to get each other to comply. There isn't a third-party enforcer in these kinds of international agreements. And they're also voluntary in the sense that countries are not bound by them unless they agree to be bound by them. In your textbook, there is a short little kind of history of foreign policy over the past few decades. It's worth taking a look at that and be familiar with some of the terms in there. The most important foreign policy actor is clearly the president and his advisors at the National Security Council. Other important actors in the executive branch include the State Department, which is the department that houses all of the diplomats, and the Secretary of State is the chief kind of go-between between the United States and other countries, and also the Defense Department, which of course houses the military. Also important in foreign policy is Congress. We've already talked to some degree about the conflict that's set up in the Constitution between Congress and the power to declare war, and the president as the commander-in-chief and the sort of the chief negotiator with foreign nations. But Congress is still very important in providing money, in debating these questions, and in offering guidance. Also important in foreign policy are non-governmental organizations like the International Red Cross, Doctors Without Borders, international organizations and interest groups like those representing lawyers and educators. There are hundreds of these kinds of international interest groups that are involved in foreign policy and that influence the government. And also intergovernmental organizations. These are organizations whose members are countries. Some examples include the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is a defensive pact. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the United Nations. The broadest piece of the United Nations is what's called the General Assembly, which is a gathering of representatives from most countries in the world who are signatories to the United Nations Treaty. And this is really a forum for discussion and cooperation. It's not in any sense a world government or a world parliament or anything like that. It's a place for countries to come together and try to discuss world problems. Within the General Assembly is a subgroup called the Security Council, and the Security Council approves sanctions, the sending of UN troops, peacekeeping troops, and they are the only body that can do this. It includes 5 permanent members who have veto power over anything the Security Council wants to approve. Those include the United States, the UK, France, China, Russia, and also 10 other rotating countries. So the veto power of these 5 permanent members is not overridable, and it's complete. So that means that if any of those 5 countries doesn't agree to anything the Security Council wants to do, then the United Nations can't actually do anything rather than serve as a forum. So for instance, right now in Syria, the United Nations is fairly inactive. In other words, there isn't any specific troops or anything like that, UN troops. Russia and the US have been in disagreement over what to do in Syria. And so in cases like that, the Security Council is not the important site of decision making. The United Nations includes other kinds of offices and functions, and I've just mentioned a few here. The World Health Organization, which administers most of the world's childhood vaccines. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that organizes refugee assistance in countries like Lebanon. The International Atomic Energy Agency, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is serving as a repository for climate change research and offering support to countries in trying to figure out a path forward on that issue. Now, the U.S. government has various tools available for foreign policy. I'll just mention 4 of these. Diplomacy is the most important tool. Most of what we see with diplomacy is the high-level political appointees like the Secretary of State participating in negotiations over the nuclear program in Iran. But most of what happens is at the level of fairly low-level everyday bureaucrats who are resolving issues between countries. So, for instance, when I spoke before about the governance that takes place between countries, it's very complicated and managed through many, many different agreements between countries, some of which are between just 2 countries. Other kinds of agreements include several. Other agreements include most countries. And they range on over an enormous number of questions, issues. So, for instance, there's an International Whaling Convention. And most countries have signed on to this, but let's assume that somebody spots a particular boat trying to follow a whale. Maybe there would be a complaint filed. People try to figure out what flag that boat is sailing under. And then, bureaucrats, low-level diplomats in those countries would try to sort out what to do about this issue. There's not an enforcer at the United Nations. There's nobody in particular to call. It's worked out between the countries. Interpol, for instance, is a relationship between most countries in the world, dealing with things like criminal investigations, and those again are sort of carried out on the level of contact between these bureaucrats. And so the order that emerges is pretty chaotic, but fairly well established. Trade is also a very important tool of foreign policy, and it's become much more important as trade has grown since the 1970s. And trade is used as both a carrot and a stick, sometimes offering a favorable trade relationship to forge cooperation. We certainly have done that with China, offering them most favored nation trade status in around at the beginning of the 2000s. In exchange for, this idea that they would be um, less hostile on questions like Taiwan, which has been in the news recently, but also maybe make some improvements on human rights. Now, they have certainly rejected the idea that they are being influenced in that way, but the idea is that when countries trade with one another, cooperation between them flows more easily. Trade is also used as a stick to punish countries. We've certainly done that with Cuba, with Iran and North Korea fairly recently. Another important tool, of course, is the military. We have the largest military by far in the world. We spend more money on it than anybody else does. And the threat of military forces is much more important than the use, in the sense that it's ever present. The use is much less common, but it's crucial as well. And finally, aid, military aid and humanitarian aid. Both of these make up a fairly small percentage of the federal budget, and it's much less influential as a tool than these others are. Now, I want to talk about a couple of issues. First, nuclear weapons, and second, climate change. The issue of nuclear weapons is managed through a treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was first accepted signatories in 1968. And since then, most countries in the world have joined the agreement, some fairly recently. Among the signers, there are two categories of countries. There are 5 countries that are allowed to have the weapon. They're the same countries that are in the Security Council, and they are countries that had the weapon already when the treaty was negotiated. Other countries under the agreement agree not to try to acquire the weapon, and also to be subject to inspections of their nuclear facilities by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They can be punished for violations if they have signed on, and they can also receive technical assistance if they sign on. There are other advantages to countries to signing on to this agreement. Nuclear weapons are fairly expensive and dangerous to keep, and so countries have been willing to sign on to this with the idea that it's going to help stop the spread, and thereby the incentive or the need to develop nuclear weapons. There are some non-signing countries, 3, that have the weapon: Israel, India, Pakistan. India had almost completed the weapon research for it when the treaty was negotiated, so they didn't want to sign up. And Pakistan, their nemesis, didn't want to sign because they knew India would have the weapon, and so they wanted it too. And so we don't punish these countries. As I said before, international law is not incumbent upon countries that don't agree to these kinds of deals. But there is one country that did sign it and then ended up acquiring the weapon, and that's North Korea. And they've been subject to just really devastating sanctions for many years. We also want to mention Iran, who did also sign on to the agreement and has been trying to acquire the weapon. They haven't admitted that publicly, but there's fairly wide agreement that that's the case. They were under sanction for many years for their program, and recently the United States, along with the 4 other members of the Security Council and Germany, entered into an agreement with Iran, we call this the Iran deal, to convince them to abandon their program, lifting sanctions that they had been under, releasing some money that had been frozen in accounts here, and also subjecting them to inspections to make sure that they're disabling their program. Now, the treaty itself is a non-proliferation treaty, which means it's its primary purpose is to stop the spread of nuclear weapons. It can seem a bit hypocritical, the notion that, well, us 5 countries are allowed to have the weapon, but you're not. But certainly the point is not to, assert a kind of rationality of these 5 countries that other countries don't possess, or to say that we're mature and you're not, so you're not allowed to have it. But simply to say that it's in everyone's interest to limit the weapon to as many countries as possible, and to recognize the very important reality, which was that none of these 5 countries was going to be willing to give up the weapon at that time. The security dangers that would open up if 4 of the countries gave up and one didn't are just too deep. And so it's based also on this notion of what we call mutually assured destruction, right? These weapons, if used, will be met with a retaliation that is at an unacceptably high cost. And so the notion behind the treaty as well is this plan that these weapons would not be used in a tactical sense, but they're only there to ensure essentially that they don't be used. Another issue, the second issue that I want to talk about is climate change. Now, the issue of climate change is one of the most difficult foreign policy challenges one could ever imagine. It affects, of course, the entire world. Countries are very differently arranged in their views of the matter about what should be done about it. It's going to be very difficult to address. Anyway, first mentioning the scientific claim, the idea that there are human-caused greenhouse gases that are changing the climate, warming in some places, maybe more deeply cold, more extreme temperatures, acidification of the oceans, rising sea levels, all of these kinds of effects caused by these heat-trapping gases that are released through human activity, like the burning of CO2, fossil fuels. Now, in terms of domestic policy making, I mean, this issue, of course, is going to require domestic political agreement, but also international agreement. And in our country, we have this odd situation where we have large numbers of politicians, especially from the Republican Party, who simply don't accept the science behind climate change and are blocking all efforts to address the question. And it's very awkward. We're really the only country in the world where you see this kind of so-called debate about the science. It's very strange. I just want to show you the homepage of the committee, the main committee in the House that's responsible for dealing with this question. There was recently kind of this debate that's being played out on Breitbart right now about the science. And this chairperson, Lamar Smith, actually retweeted some of the kind of faulty claims that are being made on Breitbart about the scientific issues around this very important question. And he's in charge, and so that means that any legislation to deal with this question are being blocked, essentially, by him and by other politicians who agree with him. So that's one issue in the domestic level. At the international level, the divisions between countries make this very difficult to address. So, for instance, one division between developed and developing countries. We know that developed countries have somewhat leveled off in terms of how much of these greenhouse gases they're releasing, but they're responsible for the past buildup of gases in the atmosphere. Developing countries, on the other hand, are probably going to keep increasing the amount of these gases they put in the atmosphere as their economies develop. There's also a division between high per capita versus low per capita emitting countries. There's also a division between rich and poor countries in terms of who should pay for this stuff, who can afford to pay for mitigation, for adaptation. And also a big division, probably one of the most difficult divisions to rise above, and that's the present versus the future. The effect of today's actions on this issue won't emerge for many decades, and so it's very difficult to represent the interests of the future. Let me just show you some information here. These are the countries that have some of the most important countries that have signed on and given pledges to address this question. The top emitting countries in terms of total amount coming out of the countries, China, and then the US, followed by the European Union countries. But as far as per capita emissions, Australia and the United States and Canada are all some of the top per capita emitters in the world, and China's fairly low as a per capita emitter. And so, China's making this double claim, well, we're developing, but we're also low per capita. But other people would say, but you're the number one, as far as country, you're the number one emitter in the world. And so this is very difficult. So just to give you a sense, China is probably going to continue on this upward trajectory, and India as well. Other countries in the European Union, for instance, have leveled off in terms of their emissions. International agreements to address climate change have been pretty hard to come by. The most important to date was an agreement called the Kyoto Protocol that was entered into in 1997. The United States never ended up joining it, and the Kyoto Protocol required action of developed countries but not developing countries, and it was also slated to expire a few years ago. The negotiations leading up to replacement of Kyoto were really thrown off track by the global financial meltdown in 2008-2009. And so it took a couple years to get back on track, and an agreement was just finalized in November last month, in November of 2016, and that's called the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is a collection of voluntary commitments of the signatories that they will take steps to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. It's a series of voluntary commitments, partly because the U.S., which is really one of the most important countries to bring into this deal, was not going to be able to sign a formal treaty that could be binding on the country because there was no way that President Obama would be able to get this through the Senate because of the Republican Party's intransigence on this question. And so because the U.S. couldn't have formal binding commitments, the framework itself is a voluntary framework. So there's no third-party enforcer as well, and it's going to be difficult, and it would always be difficult to really get transparent data on this. But that's going to be a continuing challenge. And under the Paris Agreement, every 5 years, the parties to the agreement will readjust and ratchet down the commitments that they've made to greenhouse gases, and also following the developments and the science, every 5 years to see how things how things are developing, and if it becomes more serious, then of course ratcheting down the acceptable amounts more, and maybe putting more money into adaptation.